Hello and good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'd like to welcome all of you to a special live broadcast from LaRouche TV. Tonight we will be joined by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche himself, who has decided, in the light of the absence of any qualified presidential figure in the United States today, that the responsibility has fallen to him to give this nation's annual State of the Union address. Mr. LaRouche's initial remarks will be followed by about an hour of question and answer. And we have already received several very significant questions from very high-level circles in Russia and other nations abroad, which we will begin with and give priority to. We will address these questions first, but if in the course of Lyndon LaRouche's initial remarks, you as a viewer has a question, I encourage you to send it to info.larouchepack@gmail.com, and we will receive it and hopefully have time to address it during the course of tonight's proceedings. So without further ado, a man who needs no introduction, I give you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
This, I promise you, will be an exciting evening. Not because I'm exciting, but because the nature of the subject matter is exciting. I'll take four sections of this just for your identification. The first, I'm going to deal with identifying and discussing the present great world crisis of 2012, because that's what it is. It's a crisis which is tantamount, in effect, to two world wars, and probably much worse, potentially, than the two world wars of fame. And this will include the issue of the financial crisis, which is crucial in this. And we also have in progress a high degree of potentiality for an early worldwide thermonuclear war, which might leave very little of civilization alive. That potential now exists. It does not mean it cannot be stopped, but it can only be stopped by those who are qualified and able to stop it. Because right now, amid all these other things, we're looking down the throat of a clear early potentiality for thermonuclear global war, in which the targeting will be primarily against the nations of Asia or Eurasia, Russia, China, India, and so forth. And of course, these nations can shoot back with thermonuclear weapons, just as the United States is the greatest thermonuclear power on this planet for this sort of thing. So there won't be much left of the planet if this war is actually allowed to occur. And therefore, this is a very serious business. I should also deal with, first of all, the constitutional implications. What has to be done in terms of constitutional measures and reforms, which are required as essential elements to, if we are to succeed in preventing this war from occurring. Then I shall deal with the question of economic reforms as such, physical economic reforms in particular. And then I shall take you to, at the end of this presentation, to the subject of our new galactic destiny. If we can escape a thermonuclear war in the meantime, mankind, and we on Earth in particular, have a galactic destiny before us. Something greater, more beautiful, more satisfying than anything you've ever dreamed of before. Right. Now, what we're in right now, we're in the final stage of a general breakdown crisis of all of the nations in the transatlantic community. We have at the same time a crucial kind of crisis developing in China, India, Russia, and so forth. But these nations of the Asian region, that part of the Asian region, the major powers of the Asian region, are in a much better condition economically than Europe or the Americas. And to say nothing of poor Africa, which has continued to die under the influence of British slavery of the Africans in general. So that's the first thing to consider in this. Then we have to consider actually the details of what I mean by this thermonuclear war threat. Now, what we have been since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the later assassination of his brother, when his brother Robert was about to be designated by the Democratic Party as the Democratic Party's presidential candidate. And he was eliminated by assassination, which brought us a series of disasters, including the Nixon administration, which would not have occurred without the assassination of Robert Kennedy. This breakdown crisis, which we're in now, has been going on for a long time, as I said. It was going on, in a sense, we'd made a downturn when Franklin Roosevelt died, and a British agent, virtually, a British puppet, Harry Truman, succeeded to the presidency. And from that point on, the United States lost the drive that it had for a recovery program, a post-war recovery program, which had been in place under Franklin Roosevelt. There was a systemic and intentional destruction of the potential of growth by conversion of the war potential, that is, the economic potential for war fighting, which we mobilized in the course of World War II. And at the end of that point, we had this vast apparatus. And what Truman did and the British did, and Truman did it under British orders, Churchill's first, what did was actually shut down the greatest productive potential which had ever existed on this planet, which was the potential controlled, in a sense, by the United States, which was organizing other nations of the world around this kind of program, which would have been the greatest burst of progress for humanity we'd ever heard of. But that was pretty much shut down. We went on through that. We were saved when Truman was dumped. This man was essentially a Wall Street asset. He came from the Midwest, Missouri, but he essentially was a Wall Street asset. He's very much a Wall Street man, taking orders on everything, first from Winston Churchill and then from the British government in general. So this led to that. Then we got Eisenhower, and the country was pretty sick of Truman after the few years he was president. And he also got us into a long war, which was cut off. The long war, all long wars are bad. The intention is to drag down civilization by protracted wars. When a war must be fought, and I will say that wars of that type can no longer be considered, because the threat to humanity of conducting any of these long wars under modern conditions would tend to destroy civilization. It might not eliminate the human race, but it would pretty much make a mess of it. So Eisenhower saved us. He did not succeed in reversing all of the effects which the Truman administration and Churchill and so forth had combined to develop. But he did a very good job. For example, he slapped the British in the face, got the Prime Minister of Britain to retire, and prevented a major war involving the Soviet Union in Egypt and so forth at that time. He also cooperated with Charles de Gaulle, who was then the President of France, who was a great leader, whose program would have made France a great success, but unfortunately the British, who controlled the opposition to de Gaulle, managed to frustrate him, and other events that soon happened. This came to a coup point where now Kennedy was president. His brother Robert was an active part of that presidency. They dealt with the Khrushchev and British-created crisis successfully. We escaped a major war, which would have been a nuclear war at that stage. But then Kennedy came in as part of this process, and for as long as he remained president, as long as he remained alive, not only did he continue the upturn in the United States, which Eisenhower had helped to foster, together with our dear friend in France, Charles de Gaulle, but he also introduced programs of recovery and expansion, including the space program. And his programs actually sent the United States soaring in the direction of a great recovery. It would not undo the entire damage that had been done by Truman in shutting down the post-war potential we had then. But it was a great job. It was during this period, for example, that President Kennedy organized the Glass-Steagall type of operation, but in the form of a program for developing our water system, and that was one of the great achievements. The other one was the space program. The space program was entirely the creation of John F. Kennedy. And also the development of NWAPA was his creation. So again, now at this point, the British, as usual, and shall we say, the liberal people in our own establishment decided they wanted to have a long war in Indochina. And President Kennedy said, no, we're not going to be involved in a long war in Indochina. General Douglas MacArthur was the chief advisor to Kennedy on preventing this long war. And Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, former president, had also supported that view. How then were the British and their lovers in the United States going to defeat the most successful president of the United States since President Roosevelt himself? How were they going to defeat him and get him to involve himself and the United States in a long war in Asia? They assassinated Kennedy. And then later, when his brother Robert, who had been his collaborator while president, was going to take up the position of president and was within days of receiving the nomination of the Democratic Party for the presidential candidacy, he too was assassinated. As a result of that, the United States was largely destroyed by the long war which the British had intended to run us down and to take the Franklin Roosevelt out of us, if possible. The killing of Bobby Kennedy gave us Nixon, another disaster. And there were a number of disasters with Nixon. Well, we got through that mess. Then we got another president. And this president did something good. He supported my proposal for what has become and still is the founding program for any future of the United States. And it was my invention. I've got people who were formerly in government, formerly leaders of our intelligence service, who voluntarily came over to me and said, okay, you're right, we're going to support you. I had leaders in the military in France, leaders in the military in Germany, in Italy, and other countries supported me. And as we came to the eve of what was a great movement by this president, they shut it down again. And some of the Democrats again did that. So we shut this down. Now, what they did, whether they understood it fully or not, those who shut it down, including members of the Senate of the United States, together with British-controlled clowns, such as Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, a British agent. He's still floating around in the world, in Russia, but mostly with England, where he gets his advice from, and where he gets his soul from the British, again. So what happened is that we got to a point where, because of the defeat of the SDI, which was my baby, by these political forces, they pulled down and induced the Soviet Union to destroy itself. But they also did something to destroy civilization more generally. And that was demonstrated by the fact that we're now on the verge of not only a series of wars, usually British organized, long wars, like the long wars in Afghanistan by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Long wars all over the state. A long war in Iraq that was totally unnecessary and fraudulent. So we got in long wars. In the meantime, in the background, we had the great nations of the planet were building up thermonuclear capabilities, thermonuclear warfare capabilities. These accumulated. The Soviet Union collapsed out of its folly under Gorbachev in particular. He's probably the greatest enemy Russia ever had, or was qualified for something like that. This led to more long wars. More long war in Afghanistan. More long war in the Middle East. more long war in other places. We were being destroyed. Now we've come to the point that what has been done also, well, again, the British, from the British Queen herself. The British Queen thinks there are too many of you. And she and her family and the whole kit and caboodle of the leadership of the British establishment has said, we must, knowing now that we have 7 billion people living on this planet, human beings, we're going to reduce that to 1 or less. And so we have a policy of reducing the economy and the population of the planet, especially the transatlantic region, reducing it to destruction. And we, in the process, a final stage was put in, again, one of these things, the bailout process. The bailout process was the economic suicide of the United States. And it was orchestrated from London and by Wall Street clowns who are actually London agents, not Americans, really. They may have American citizenship, but they're not American in spirit or morality. And they started the great bailout. What happens now? They have successfully destroyed the economy of the United States in a long wave of things which began essentially in the later period, but essentially with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That set into motion a long war in Indochina, a destruction of our technological capability, a moral and intellectual destruction of our young people, who were then coming out of junior high school and high school ages, who degenerated morally, and then had produced children of degenerated morally parents. And the nation became more and more corrupted, self-corrupted. And we got to the point that the whole nation, all of Europe, the United States, the transatlantic region generally, has gone into a deep economic collapse, such that we now have a situation where we could not, without a change from the current policies, we could not guarantee an adequate food supply beginning this spring for the population of the United States and for the population of other nations. We've come to that point. We're now at the point with this bailout, which it bankrupted the United States in every way imaginable. No one could ever pay that debt. It could never be paid. And we're having this worthless debt piled on us geometrically. It's killing us. And it can be stopped, as I shall get to that later. But in the meantime, the British Empire, the British Queen, the ones who want to reduce the numbers of you from 7 billion to 1 or less, has proceeded to organize a war with the complicity of a British agent who is currently the President of the United States. He's nothing but a British puppet. He has no mind of his own. He's actually clinically insane. But they keep him on as president despite that. So what happens? Now we have, in the meantime, Russia has come back to some degree under the leadership of Putin in particular and Medvedev and others, has come back in programs which would actually successfully not only rebuild Russia, the whole area of Russia, including the Siberian area, but it would open up areas of development throughout the world, because Russia has certain technologies which are specific to them. In the meantime, China now represents 4 billion or 1.4 billion people. India represents 1.1 billion people. These have been weakened by the international economic problem, but they have still maintained a certain factor of growth and progress. Japan is by a smaller nation, but a vigorous nation, as we see with the tsunami operation. No nation but Japan could have done as successful a rescue operation as Japan did, and the recovery operation. No one could. So we have Japan, who wants to cooperate. We have an improvement in the situation in Korea, where the North and South Korea are now going to more of a collaboration. This is excellent development. But the British Empire, which is behind all this thing, which owns their clown called Obama, this psychotic clown. And they don't like that. So they decided to start a great new war. This time a thermonuclear war, in which the United States would be a key force under this President Obama. Other nations, Britain is a somewhat downtrodden thermonuclear power. France is a thermonuclear power. Other nations have some thermonuclear capabilities. China has a very important thermonuclear capability. Russia has a very important thermonuclear capability. Now, what are these guys trying to do? Well, it happened when you had a law was rammed through the Congress by a leading senator, collaboration with the president. And that law set into motion and authorized an illegal action called the Libya War. The U.S. involvement in a war in Libya was a violation of the Constitution. It was a criminal act by the President of the United States, an impeachable act. And what they did then, you had Britain, France, and the United States, and some other collateral powers who were going ahead with this Libya war. And they succeeded in getting to the point, through President Obama, of bringing the country down. Then you had the president of Libya, who was president, who was defeated, had agreed to admit that he'd been defeated by this force of ours. But then the British were not satisfied, nor was the President of the United States satisfied. Because the problem, as they put it, in France and elsewhere, the problem was that if he lived and they held him as a captive, they would have to try him. If they put him through a trial, this would delay going to the next chosen target. So they had him killed, murdered. Here's a man who's captive. No evidence has been presented. The trial has not been established. But to avoid a trial of the accused, they murdered him, Obama style, which Obama's been doing to Americans and others recently, on this way. So now we come to the point, what's this all about? Why should this crazy idiot, our president, why should he want to make a war against a rather small nation, weak nation, Libya? Why should he want to do that? Why should he want, as he did, together with the French government, together with the British government, they connived to assassinate a captive who had been the head of state of a nation? Why would they do that? Well, they said so. They said, we cannot allow ourselves to be tied up with a long dealing, bringing to a conclusion this case of the Libya case. Why? Because they said, we intend to start wars immediately against two West Asian nations, Syria and Iran. Now, the purpose of doing this was not to conduct a war against Syria and Iran. That was not the purpose. That was the sideshow. What you had, if you looked at the map and looked at the Eastern Mediterranean and the bay around Iran, you saw the greatest concentration of thermonuclear warfare capabilities on this planet, represented by the forces of the United States, Britain, and other powers. Why would they have to have the thermonuclear capabilities of major powers and others combined against two small nations, a relatively very small nation, Libya, and a medium-sized small nation, shall we say, Iran? Why? Because their target wasn't Libya. Their target wasn't Iran. Their target is, as we know now from the diplomatic scandals that have broken out in Washington and Europe, the target was Russia and China. What does that mean? Why should Britain and the United States and other nations wish to launch thermonuclear war against two great thermonuclear powers, Russia and China? And you have a nuclear power, Pakistan, and India is also a thermonuclear power. So what you have is the entirety of Asia, that part of Asia, is now under death threat from this president, who's not fit to be in a cattle barn. And the suckers are letting this happen. This man, under the Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, is clinically insane. The terms are specific. This man is clinically insane. And what the other side of the thing, our leaders in the Congress, and some of them are people I like and think they're otherwise nice people or properly in their duties, but they're not acting that way. Just like Kerry, Senator Kerry, has acted in a terrible way. Nothing like we used to think of him. I once supported this man in his candidacy for president. I wouldn't do so today. He's changed. He's not the same man he was then. And if you know his record, that's a striker. So therefore, what's the point? The British now say, what's the purpose of this? They told you. The purpose is, as the Queen of England and others have insisted, their intention is to reduce the population of the planet from 7 billion people to 1 or less. Their argument is the green policy. And therefore, if you want to have a green policy, and what that connotes, you cannot tolerate Russia's existence. You cannot tolerate 1.4 billion people in China. You cannot tolerate 1.1 billion people in India and other nations. Therefore, this is a British operation run under the green policy of Her Majesty the Queen and her cohorts to change the character of the planet in this way. In other words, these guys make Hitler look like a piker. And we in the United States have a president who is the leading edge of that policy under British orders, the British monarchy's orders. That's why this is the big crisis. And that's why anyone in politics who's running for president or similar rank of office and doesn't deal with this ain't fit to be elected anything. We don't have any, there's some of these candidates, a couple of Republican candidates are sane. I would admit that. Some of them are not sane. I will also emphasize that. And we have a similar kind of situation among others. We are a nation which has temporarily lost its guts, lost its morals and its guts, because the evidence of this is what it is. Now, in fact, the only reason that I know of that we're not already in that war is because people in the Joint Chiefs and other institutions have said, don't go ahead. So it's only a minority, but an important minority in our government, which is organized resistance against this thing, which is far worse, evil, far more evil than anything Adolf Hitler ever accomplished in his intention. And that's where the problem lies. And therefore we have to deal with it accordingly. Anyone who's running for office who does not say this president, Obama, must be immediately removed under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is not fit to choose our government. They haven't got the guts and the honesty to do it. They can't be trusted because they refuse to respond to their responsibility to the office for which they were elected, or which they have the prospect of being elected. They are not fit to live. And therefore, look at the clown show we have going on outside of this nation. Look at the Republican campaign so far. It's a clown show. One of those guys in there is decent fellow. He's intelligent, decent, probably under most circumstances would do a good job. He was a former governor of a state. And I think he's intelligent enough to be that. But look at the rest of it. Who is standing up? Who is fit to run for a federal office? Who's fit to choose a candidate for federal office? Who does not recognize these implications? Where is someone who will stand up who has the guts to be errand boy, let alone president? And that's where we are today. And that's the first thing you have to consider. We are dealing under a regime of evil. The organizer of that evil essentially is the British monarchy. The most conspicuous tool of that evil is the current president of the United States and his accomplices. And that's what's wrong with our government. And anybody who wants to break any other issue, any different issue, contrary to what I've just said here as an issue, is not fit to vote, let alone be elected. Because the whole fate of humanity depends upon defeating what this British operation under the Queen and what this President of the United States represents. They are unfit to be in public office in any major nation. And those who support them are not fit to hold important office in any nation. And yet, why do our people act like clowns and vote for these Republicans who've just been running? I don't know what cure we give them for the running, but that's what they've been doing. Huh? Where's the sense in this whole election campaign that started this year? Where's the sanity? Where's the morality? Where's the morality and intelligence of the citizens who would participate in this atrocity called an election campaign, the Republican election campaign? And what we have on the Democratic side, we have Obama, the more than Hitler of the United States. People will support him? What's wrong with their minds and morals? They say they want to lead this nation, they want to determine the policies of this nation, when the way they lead is leading the world to a Holocaust beyond belief? No, this election campaign in the United States, so far, among the leading parties, is a farce. And the sooner you recognize that, and say so, and act so, the sooner we might get out of this mess. Right. Now, there's some other aspects here to be dealt with. Assuming that we're going to oppose thermonuclear war, oppose this Holocaust, what's next? Well, let's take the question of the U.S. Constitution. There are two actions which must be taken now by any authorities who deserve to be called authorities. The United States, like all of Western and Central Europe, is now bankrupt. It is under its present statutes, its present constitution, it is hopelessly bankrupt. There's no way under these kinds of political leaders with these policies that the United States or Western or Central Europe is going to survive. Not possible. Well, where's the seriousness on this one? You want to pick somebody for president? You want to pick a party group for president with these kinds of clowns loose? Where's your guts? Where's your mentality? Where's your brains? Where's your morality? The evidence is clear. We are bankrupt. Look, all that bailout money between Europe and the United States that has been done so far will never be paid. It's worthless. And worse than that, than the worthlessness of that money, is the fact that a slight twitch right now, as we see this in Europe, in Greece, for example, threatened in Italy, for example, threatened in Spain, threatens in Portugal, threatened in other parts of Europe. We're on the verge of a general collapse. In other words, it's like 1923 Germany, but on a multinational level. What are we doing about that? Where's our economic policies? More bailout? The whole thing is totally bankrupt now. There's no value in it. All it takes is a twitch, and the whole system goes down. And the Queen gets closer to her ambition of reducing the world's population from 7 to 1 billion people. Because that type of catastrophe can have exactly that kind of effect. Well, where are the politicians that are saying something about that, or doing something about that? You want to call them serious? Can you call yourself sane if you consider voting for one of these clowns? Can't we find some Americans who are not clowns, who have the guts to tell the truth about the situation? The United States now, in its present condition, is hopelessly bankrupt and on the verge of going the same way that Greece is going right now. What are you going to do about it? Where's your morals? Where's your brains? Now, there's a remedy for this. And it's not a remedy that London and Wall Street likes. I have to concede that. They won't like it at all. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing is two things we have to do which are constitutional in their character. First of all, they're constitutional against the background of our Constitution. Also, they are matters which, people don't understand economics. The leading economists generally in the United States are distinguished by the fact of their total ignorance of economics. They have these myths. Anyone who could believe that bailout is a help to the world economy when it's nothing but a complete bankruptcy of every part of the world that's in on it? Of course, the British have a view on this thing, the British monarchy. You're going to kill a lot of people. That's good as far as they're concerned. They say so repeatedly. But the other side is they don't intend to play by the rules. They intend to see the world collapse around them, and they intend to have a survival group which is going to come up with a completely new system to replace, they hope, the bankrupt system that they've made bankrupt. So therefore, there are two things we have to do. But the two things are under one idea, one principle. The principle is, as far as we know, from direct evidence, in European civilization and beyond, nations have been governed by a system which is called a monetarist system. Now, the peculiarity of this monetarist system, which virtually no economist in the United States understands, and very few in Europe. We used to understand this when we had the Massachusetts colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We understood what the difference was between a monetarist system and a credit system. The United States government, the Constitution, was based on the concept of a credit system. But with Andy Jackson, who was not exactly a patriot of the United States, worked under a whore, a British whore, who followed him as president. And they shut down the essential institution of banking of the United States. Our system, which we got in the period coming out of the victory in the Revolutionary War, and in the process of creating our Constitution, went to the precedent of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to create a credit system. In other words, not money, not a money system, but a credit system, where in the Massachusetts Bay Colony created credit, not currency, not monetary system. And the credit was simply credit by the government, or the collectivity of the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to allow certain scrip to be uttered, to allow for the production of goods and the means of production. Under this policy, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was way ahead of the British Kingdom in terms of technology and in terms of economic growth. It only lost that growth after it was suppressed by the head of what was called the New Venetian Party, which led into the establishment of the British Empire. Now, what happened with Andrew Jackson, that whore Jackson, and I say it advisedly, he's a democratic whore. They say he's a Democrat. Well, he's a whore, so therefore he must be a Democratic whore. What he did was to induce with his boss, who was later president, who had the great crash of 1837. This destroyed the credit system of the United States by that operation by Andrew Jackson under the orders of his boss, who gave the 1837 crash. We've had recoveries from that kind of effect since that time. One, in fighting the Civil War. In the case of the Civil War, we went to greenbacks. Now, the greenback system was a credit system, and it's a credit system which is specified in our Constitution. It's one of the strongest features of intent in the U.S. federal Constitution, is that the United States currency is based on a credit system, not a monetary system. And everything we've been ruined in economy in the United States has generally been a result of a return to this kind of monetary system, some kind of monetary system, as opposed to our constitutional system, which is a credit system. Now, I'll explain what this means. We're now bankrupt. The whole country is bankrupt. The situation of our people is generally hopeless for most people right now. How do we cure that? Well, we have two things we can do, which will get us out of this mess. One is called Glass-Steagall. Now, Glass-Steagall, which was a law crafted under Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president, this saved the United States and made us the greatest power again in world history at that time, and defeated Hitler. Without Glass-Steagall, Hitler would be ruling the world today, or something like him. So therefore, this system, which we keep going back to every time we want to have an American-style recovery, is going back to the concept of a credit system, which is built into the design of our federal Constitution. Now, a lot of jerks don't understand this. That's why they're called jerks. Because if anyone who's trying to run the United States, who doesn't know the principle which makes the United States function effectively, is not qualified to be advising anybody on how to run the United States. All right, so now we have a broken down economy. The economy was broken down beforehand, before 2004, or 2008 rather. But the breakdown was aggravated by the bailout. The bailout, as in Europe, the interchange between the U.S. banking system, the Wall Street type of system, taking over the U.S. banks, not only those banks which are Wall Street type of banks, but also the commercial banks. So our entire banking system and the looting of our mortgage system was engineered by this mechanism of the monetary system. And now the actual debt of the United States, the debt of Europe, far exceeds anything that could ever be paid. Well, I say, go use Glass-Steagall. Number one, use Glass-Steagall. Roosevelt created it. It's in the tradition of the United States, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, on the pine tree shilling system. And what we did with the idea of the paper currency by Benjamin Franklin is his proposal, then under Franklin's influence became the policy of our Secretary of the Treasury. And that became a constitutional principle. And every success we've had in the United States since that time has been based on those periods in which we went back to that principle of credit, the credit system. Abraham Lincoln, credit system, that saved the United States from destruction. Roosevelt saved the United States from destruction by the credit system, which is his idea, Glass-Steagall. He did not go all the way, but he went far enough to enable us to recover, to become again a powerful nation of the world, and to win World War II. And that was only destroyed under the influence of Harry S. Truman. There was no period after S. His mother never got around to finding the full name, so just the S is standing out there. All right. So now but that's not adequate, because we have a broken down economy. There's no chance of any full recovery. The hope to most people out there, they have no real basis for hope. Not under this system. Even Glass-Steagall, while it is necessary to get rid of the real garbage, which is what it does, Glass-Steagall puts the garbage in the garbage pail and leaves what is not garbage to be used. But the problem is the system has been so rotted out by the looting, by this monstrous looting, that even Glass-Steagall would not be sufficient to cause an actual recovery of the U.S. economy, physically. But, however, these systems, which are based on that kind of monetary system, even of any improved type, will not allow the nation to come back to life. So therefore we have to go to what's called a pure credit system and do the same thing all over again. Now the only way we can do that is by fully acting and putting the entire United States system, banking system and so forth, on the credit system. Why? Because in the kind of money you would get in the banking system from Glass-Steagall, you will not get enough money as credit in the system to organize an effective recovery of the United States from the slide into hell where it's going right now. However, under a credit system, we can utter credit legally and properly based on the amount of good we intended to do. In other words, we just say, we the federal government, as we did in bailing out from the debt of the United States coming out of the victory over the British in the Revolutionary War. We utter credit by the federal government, no other authority, in order to cover the loans needed to finance the recovery we need. Under Glass-Steagall, you can't do that because you're limited to the amount of funds you're able to salvage from the bailout. If you want to have a recovery of the United States, you must dump the monetary system and go to a credit system, which is what the United States did in coming out of the Revolutionary War as an indebted nation, is exactly what Lincoln did to win the war against the British in the Civil War. It's what Roosevelt did in his own intention, but he had the resources available under that intention to save the United States and save the world from Hitler. So that's where we are again, and that's what we have to do. That's the constitutional thing. This is a constitutional principle, not an ordinary piece of legislation. Glass-Steagall was passed as a legislation, but the principle of credit is a principle, not an ordinary law. And it's the return by agreement to return to that principle, which is the way we can save this nation from a collapse which is now about to hit it. Without that method, there is no collapse. This has another aspect to it. Why is the United States developed a credit system when no other system in the world, at least in European systems, actually ever developed a credit system, except for Charlemagne? He's dead, of course, and not able to do that anymore. But so therefore, what we have to do essentially is extend the idea of a credit system to our partners in various parts of the world. All they have to do is do the same thing we do. They now will clean up their mess, take all this cheap money, these phony money, put it in the garbage pail, and we go with a credit system which is based on the kind of investment we need to make and implement in order to save the United States, in order to save our partners from other nations. The same thing. So that's where we stand on that. That should be our policy. It should be our policy we propose to our partners. For example, the intention of Russia in particular, now, under Medvedev and Putin, is a serious attempt to set up close cooperation between Russia and the United States, among other nations. And such an agreement between the United States, which means removing Obama from office, of course, would actually be the basis for organizing a large group of major and other nations together to save the economy of the world. There is the technology available. We can catch up. One of the things we have to do is, apart from Glass-Steagall, is NWAPA. It's a typical program. NWAPA was a creation of President, guess who? Yeah, John F. Kennedy. Yeah. He was the one who authored this thing and put it back in. And it was killed because he was killed, part of the process. So therefore, we have, under our law, under our system, a perfectly rational, clearly understandable method for dealing with these problems. And the fact that these are the aspirations of Russia under the present government, that we have a similar attitude on the part of China, 1.4 billion people, a similar attitude now coming out of Korea, a similar attitude in Japan, and other nations. So what are we waiting for? We have the greatest part of the population of the planet. Will come to join us in this process if we reach the agreement among 2 or 3 of the major parties in this situation. So that's our operation. The problem is this. There's a theory behind this crime. Monetarism is a crime against humanity. But what is the theory behind it? It goes back a long ways. It goes back in European and Mediterranean history in a particular way. That you had a class of people who called themselves gods. They were actually called gods. The use of the word God, or its translation of the same term, meaning, meant that there were certain people who ruled over the planet. They were the real human beings. The other human beings were not really human. They were treated as animals, like cattle. And that was the system. So the word gods, as it was translated from various languages and used in the Greek, for example, was exactly that. There are some people who rule the world by gods. Now, how do they do this? Well, first of all, they keep the majority of people stupid and not too plentiful. You don't allow scientific and technological progress. The Promethean principle. You don't allow fire, don't allow mankind to learn how to use fire. Or nuclear power, for example, which is a form of power. And therefore, you keep the population of the human species down to a limit which you decide to tolerate. Don't let them have technology. Keep them dumb and barefoot. And that's called the monetary system. How does it work? The gods are the gods of various nations, like the Wall Street gods. You know what filth they are. The gods of various nations decide we're going to keep control of this system. We're going to keep the people not too plentiful and dumb, stupid. We cannot allow them to have fire, because mankind is the only species that can use fire. The only species that is willing to use fire is mankind. No other species. That's the difference between a monkey and a human being. And obviously, some people are monkeys by that rule. So the monetary system is the value represented by an oligarchy, like the Wall Street conception. An oligarchy takes a monopoly on all money and declares that only money in that form can be used as credit. And that's how we're made. Now, the other side of the fact is this, is the human species can't tolerate that, really. Because without technological and scientific progress, and without the increase of the human population in size and numbers, we cannot maintain the human species as existing. Because we're living under conditions in which the gradually old ways of life, like take the dinosaurs, for example. What happened to the dinosaurs? They stuck to the old ways of behaving. And nature took care of them. They're gone. So therefore, the issue is that the idea of a monetary system is a way of imposing a dictatorship over the masses of populations. Whereas a credit system has the opposite effect. And this is the difference, the fundamental difference between the United States and the Europeans. It's not that the Europeans like this stuff, but they're taught that they have to accept the law. The law under which they rule, as under the Roman Empire and the successors, is that system. And therefore, in the United States, we have gone back, we reinvented the credit system, is in Massachusetts, and later, in our Constitution. The Europeans stuck to some version of a monetarist system. And that's how the empire ruled in Europe. Therefore, we are going to a credit system in which the only money that is allowed to be uttered in the name of the United States government is a credit system. You know? And thus that credit system now becomes the means for organizing employment. What you have now, like the farm belt. You have the agricultural system of the world is being starved by illegal methods, like Monsanto. What Monsanto is doing is rape of the United States and other nations. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. It shouldn't happen. But therefore we now have the means, by control of the monetary system, to starve whom we wish to starve, by channeling money, by asserting its value in other terms. So we control what is perceived as the value of money. We control what is considered in monetary terms the value of various kinds of products and services. Therefore, we are under that kind of dictatorship. And we in the United States, who have been unique in leading this kind of revolution, which is why we came here in the first place. Because Nicholas of Cusa recognized that the European system was not salvageable, that we had to go across the waters and bring our culture to other parts of the planet, and to develop a system which would meet the needs of the people, and then go back to the old European system and tell them, good news, we've got the solution for your mistakes. And that's what we have to stand for. So therefore we need that kind of thing. The United States presently will not continue to exist, with or without a thermonuclear war, will not continue to exist without going to a credit system in place of a monetary system. What has been done in terms of the bailout has reached such enormity that even Glass-Steagall could not save the United States unless we applied to Glass-Steagall the standard of a credit system. And without that, we're not going to survive. Those who wish to survive will agree with me. Those who don't agree with me do not wish to survive, because they will not survive if they rule. Okay, now those are the only constitutional principles that I'm pushing at this time. I have other notions of constitutional principles which should be incorporated in the law of the United States as part of the Constitution, or interpretations of the Constitution. But I didn't want to do that now because I didn't want to open the gates for a flood of wild-eyed, cockeyed ideas, like from the Austrian School of Finances or some group like that. These nuts will call that. So therefore I did not want to open the gates to allow this kind of fraud, called like the Austrian School of Fraud, which I think Mitt Romney is part of, or is close to people who believe in that. And therefore he can't be president of the United States. That cannot be allowed, unless he has a complete conversion from something more sane. But that's typical of the problem. What we have to do now is, what are we going to do? We've discussed money, we've discussed the politics of money, things like that. What are we going to do now with this poor world? Well, one thing we're going to do, we have to do, we're going to have, as some people know here in the room here and elsewhere, we're going to go to Mars. Now, we're not going to pack our bags and go to Mars. That's not the way this thing works. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a technology which we now have, but which needs a little perfecting. We're going to take those tunnels in the moon. We will probably send people directly to Mars, but they'll be sacrificing their lives in doing so at this time. Their lives will be shortened considerably. But we're not going to chug along to Mars either. We're going to have to go to a method of power which will enable us to reach Mars within a week from Earth. Now this is going to change the whole man's understanding of mankind. And it's something which we will be working with now. There are several principles which I'm working on right now. First of all, we realize that the thermonuclear fusion driver for travel between Earth and Mars is necessary. We also recognize that to go efficiently to Mars, we have to make a little intervention, which was understood by some German scientists back in the 1920s. We have to go to the moon first. And therefore we get out, aim at the moon, where we build up resources, which we then shoot at longer distances and thermonuclear fusion-driven rates. You know, it's acceleration out, deceleration down. And we can do that in about a week. That's what our prospect is. That changes everything. It changes man's relationship to the solar system. It changes implicitly our relationship to the universe. And these are things which we cannot realize overnight, but we can set into process the motion which will enable these things to happen. We will then no longer be poor human beings sitting vulnerably on this poor planet of ours, waiting for our extermination. Humanity will be moving throughout the solar system and finding ways to live and develop throughout the solar system. We'll be invading the galaxy, at least some part of the galaxy. We'll be developing things which are the future of mankind. They will happen long after I'm dead, but they will happen, and that's what's important. So we have a number of things that go into this. First of all, that's the big one. Right now, the big one is that Mars travel, with the development of the tunnels of the moon as the way in which we build up the capabilities logistically of supporting the Mars operation and going further. We're going to go out there to save mankind, what Obama would not allow. We're going to prevent asteroids from crashing into Earth and killing human beings. That can be done. We have to develop the capability of doing it. Russia and China are working on that kind of problem itself. So we're going to go out there and we're going to do a lot of useful things. But at the same time we're going to the Mars mission, we're going to do some other things. We now have a situation where there's melting of the Arctic. Now the greenies would think that's terrible. Well, let them freeze their what off, if you know. We are going to enjoy this thing because we're going to go with the right fur, the right stuff, and all these kinds of things. We're not going to have our frozen off. So therefore, we have NWAPA. We put together the space program and NWAPA and some other programs which are of the same nature, where you are developing the ability of the Earth to defend and sustain human life on Earth and beyond. Then you've created a real economy. And more than that thing, we human beings, we live a certain amount of time. The British think I've lived too long, for example. But what we human beings, the problem we have is we think that when we die, which will comes along to us sooner or later, we think that means that life is over, or the meaning of life is over. Well, life is over, but the meaning of life is not over. When you think about traveling the distance from Earth to Mars in a week, and think what that means on a larger scale, that means that mankind is now connected to generations ahead by these kinds of improved means. That the meaning of life has changed for mankind from what most people think it is now. They see the true connection between scientific progress, the discovery of the increased power of mankind in the universe. We understand what that means in terms of what we discover today, which is realized down the line, today, several generations down the line. But several generations down the line today, when you think about flight to the Earth to moon, you realize that we've changed the relationship among successive generations. And that is where we have to go and where we have to think. We have to redefine what most people think is human life and the purpose of human life. We've got to change that. We've got to realize that you may be dying in the morning, but before you die, you will have unleashed something into the future, which means your life means something for a long time to come. And that's the difference in the way mankind thinks about man, which we have to realize today. So this defines essentially, to sum up, a galactic option. We are now, as mankind, we're on the verge, and we who are working, say, in the basement team and so forth, our basement team, are thinking in exactly these terms. You're going to see some things coming out on our publications in the coming period, which is more and more of this. we are really got the bit in our mouth on this one. And we're going to get, I'm not particularly urgent about getting to Mars myself personally, but I'm very much concerned about the success of those who will take that journey. Their life, their success, and the fruits of their influence. So that's where we are. And when we want to think about the United States, we have to think not about a nation, how you manage a nation, like some grocery store or something. No? You have to think about what a nation is. It's the repository of a continuing process of development of the powers of mankind in the universe to accomplish things that mankind can do or will be able to do under this kind of program. And when we talk about the purpose of life, we talk about the meaning of the life of our children and grandchildren. That's what we should understand. Not some futile cry, oh, you're dead, you're gone, I can't reach you anymore, my life doesn't mean anything anymore. No, it should mean something. If you're contributing something to the future of mankind across future generations and help to make that leap by this kind of technology, this kind of science, your immortality is not to be doubted. Because what you can do while you're alive here or some other part of the system, what you can do will reach across generations directly from what you are. And it's that sense of your own value in that kind of role in life, which must be the mission which we and Russia and China and so forth must share in common. Now, one final note on this thing. We've reached the point where it's been demonstrated, and it was already true during the 1920s even then, but now in the 1970s and beyond. The development of methods of warfare, such as nuclear warfare and thermonuclear warfare and other systems of which are now coming online, mean that it's not possible, as the present case before us, the question of the British intention together with Obama to slaughter most of the human race in Asia, right now, that we can no longer have war in that sense, in that way. Because we cannot put the existence of the human species at risk when it is the essence of our existence. We cannot destroy the essence of a human existence as a species, particularly since our species is a creative species, explicitly so. Therefore, mankind is too precious to be killed. That does not mean we can't have quarrels. That does not mean we shouldn't have sovereignty of nations. Yes, we should, because only with the sovereignty of nations can you actually develop the mind of the people of nations. This idea that's going on in Europe, of so-called governance. Do you realize that most of Western and Central Europe, those people have no government, they have no sovereignty? They're not allowed to have sovereignty. I'm concerned to get the British out and give the people back in Europe their sovereignty. The Greeks are about to take it out of desperation. Italy's ready to take it, not out of desperation, but out of rage and anger. So therefore, there is a meaning of life. There's a meaning of human life. We cannot put mankind at risk. The way we avoid that is by adopting common missions for mankind. There was an old curmudgeon who was a sort of a funny friend of mine back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He's now deceased. But there was a conference which was held on behalf of the SDI policy on this, talking about the common aims of mankind. There is such a principle as the common aims of mankind. And under the common aims of mankind, such things as an alliance between Russia and the United States, which is now available. Get rid of Obama, do some of the things we want to do. With China is there. With Japan is there. There is such a thing as the common aims of mankind among different, respectively, sovereign nations. And it's that principle of law, the higher principle of law, the higher principle of sovereignty, which must rule. We can no longer risk the kind of wars that that babbling idiot, that rage ball, Obama and the Queen, are pushing. That is the ultimate crime, because by implication as well as direct cause, they are committing a crime against humanity per se. And they must be removed from office and from power, because we cannot allow these clowns to control the fate of nations anymore. Thank you.
If you're just tuning in, you're watching a live broadcast from LaRouchesupport TV. This is a State of the Union address from Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. And we have about a 1-hour period open to us for questions and answers. We've already received quite a number of questions from across the planet, and I'm going to give priority to a number of very high-level questions that have come in from Russia. The first that I'm going to start with is from a very well-known strategic analyst, a Mr. Professor Igor Panarin, who's the Doctor of Political Sciences at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Professor Panarin starts with some short comments. He says, "I appreciate what Lyndon LaRouche and his close collaborators do, because many people in the world, including in Russia, are beginning to recognize reality. Like Lyndon, I also believe that the main threat to both the USA and Russia, and to the whole world, is a group of private individuals in London, who for hundreds of years have been organizing bloody wars all over the world for their own gain. These London bankers organized the world narcotics trade, which is killing hundreds of thousands of people every year. I think that all clear-headed intellectuals worldwide from different countries should unite their efforts to save the world from the chaos into which the London financiers are taking it." Now, Professor Panarin has two questions. First, what measures should be taken immediately to prevent the destabilization of Russia? He says, "I consider Gorbachev responsible for the demise of the USSR, and I think that he always championed British interests, and now he is being used to actively break up Russia." And his second question, how can the situation in the United States be changed so that people would come to power who realize that the British bankers have been secretly running America for a long time? And he asks, is there any possibility that Ron Paul could win? He's demanding the elimination of the Federal Reserve System and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and Germany. Thank you in advance.
Well, first of all, I'm not recommending Ron Paul for anything. I know the gentleman very well, and he's of the Austrian school, and that's not the kind of thing we want to spread around this planet. Let Ron do what he wants to do, but don't make him president or anything foolish like that. He does not understand anything about economy. He does not wish to understand anything about economy. We're in an economic crisis. We don't need his advice. On the more optimistic part of the thing, we can do it now. If we, take these, as the professor knows, there are people in relevant institutional positions in the United States who agree with me on this thing. We are not going to have a war. We're not going to have a war in Libya. We're not going to have a war in Iran. We're not going to allow it. We're going to hold the hands of those damn fools who want to play with this kind of stuff, because the only result they can create. Remember, the weapons capability exists, and people in Russia are among those who understand that. You cannot have that situation. You can't, because it would mean the extinction or virtual extinction of the human species. And therefore, anybody who wants to go to that war, including Obama, who is a lunatic already, he's insane. I diagnosed him back in April of 2009, and everything I said about him has been true. He is a modern reincarnation of the Emperor Nero. That's his mentality. His behavior is that. He's not fit for human company. Let him have a basketball in some place in a court. Let him bounce his balls forever. Well, just keep him out of our government. So the issue here is we do have, on the basis of human need, on the safety of the people of this planet, not to have a thermonuclear war. If we allow a thermonuclear war, humanity is in danger of extinction. Anybody who would, like Obama, anyone like Obama, with a Nero-like mentality, don't give him that power. Don't give it to him. Get him out of there now. He's nuts. He's nuts. And there's no excuse for tolerating him in office any longer. The only excuse is the lack of guts of people to do something about it. Under those conditions, given the great poverty which is striking the world today, given what nations such as Russia, China, India, and so forth, as important powers, can do, the need for cooperation in economic progress of the type I've indicated today, here, that direction of progress is what all nations need. Russians, I know, because I know of what their attitudes are in part. They understand that. China is coming to a richer understanding of that. India will understand that in its own terms. Japan recognizes that in its own terms, like the recent rescue of that. Korea is now coming to the same thing. So why should we be at odds with each other in military way? We can resolve our problems by keeping the subject matter on what we need in progress. We don't have to quarrel about taking something away from somebody else. What we have to worry about is the need that we participate in assuring peace by helping the creation of those means by which the needs of mankind are assured. And this is, I agree with his position totally, naturally. There's no secret about that.
Good. I want to read another question, which is rather short, and then pose a third from Russia. Both of these, I think, are worthy to be grouped together. The first is from another gentleman who you know, Mr. Alexander Nagorny, who's the deputy editor of the Zavtra weekly newspaper, which is based out of Moscow. And he asks questions which have implicitly been answered by what you've said. His first is, he says, my first question is a future-oriented one. What are the prerequisites for far-reaching U.S.-Russian political, economic, and financial cooperation? And I think you've highlighted that. And his second question is there any possibility that a future administration will take strategic steps such as ending the power of the Federal Reserve and returning it to the Congress, along with the return to the Glass-Steagall law? Now, this second question is a little bit more lengthy, but I think it's worthwhile reading because it contains some important strategic intelligence which pertains to, actually, Professor Panarin's question about the destabilization of Russia. This question comes from a longtime Russian political and human rights activist. He says, Mr. LaRouche, decades ago you warned of the current world financial crisis, and you demonstrated that free market liberalism is a dead end, imposed by an anti-human, parasitical transnational so-called elite. Now this crisis threatens to become a global catastrophe. And when that elite can't get what they want by force, blackmail, and agentry, they attack national sovereignty under the cover of demagogy about democracy, freedom, and human rights. Our country has been attacked using all of those methods at once. Now we have a shameful farce where some members of the ruling caste, liberals like the former Minister of Finance Kudrin, former Governor Boris Nemtsov, the oligarch Mikhail Prokhorov, and the Yale University-trained blogger Alexei Navalny, are parading around as the would-be leaders of citizens, who actually do have good reason to protest. In this situation, my concern is that the current Russian leadership will either voluntarily capitulate to this opposition circus, or will be forced out after attempting to carry out something like Gorbachev's perestroika policy. Russia could disintegrate during such a process with ethnic conflicts and separatism. As you know, he says, we have a presidential campaign underway from which representatives of the patriotic opposition like General Ivashov have been excluded. Not long before the campaign started, The Obama administration named, now this is important, Michael McFaul as ambassador to Russia. He is not a career diplomat. He is a Russian studies specialist who for many years has been tied to the liberal reformers. People I know were told by McFaul personally that when he came to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and the early 90s on various democratization projects, he was never interested in achieving democracy as such, but explicitly rather the collapse of the Soviet Union. On Monday of this week, McFaul presented his credentials, and on Tuesday he met with representatives of the liberal opposition to the Kremlin. My questions are, what political circles does McFaul represent? What are their goals in appointing McFaul as ambassador to Russia at such a moment of tension? Has Michael McFaul been sent here with the same intention of breaking up Russia as he had toward the Soviet Union over 20 years ago?
Exactly. And McFaul is not really an American. His pedigree, his political pedigree, is totally British. And of course, Susan Rice is his sidekick. So we know exactly what this is. This is a foul ball put into office as a diplomat now by a foul ball called the President of the United States and Susan Rice. And if you know what Susan Rice is, now these people, I'm perfectly free to say the truth about these people, because what they have done against me and against Russians at the same time is a known fact. These guys are foul balls who don't belong in office in any nation. And the sooner we understand that, the better off, safer we'll all be.
Good, very clear. Now, switching from Russia to the southern hemisphere, this question comes from Argentina. And this is from Rosina Castillo, and she asks, recently in Argentina, we've had a series of mysterious deaths of public officers, and also our president, Cristina Kirchner, has had a serious illness, because of which she had surgery. We are still operating under our vice president to this day due to that illness. Rosina says, we cannot see these developments as separated from the context of the real world history as you have defined it. We're at the verge of thermonuclear World War III, and the British will do whatever to unleash chaos in the world. Until now, we thought that given the recent moves from the Russians to stop the Southwest Asia New Balkans to get into a war, maybe now the British will look into other places like Argentina to start a war. As you know very well, the conflict about the Malvinas Islands is escalating. And today, the British Prime Minister accused Argentina of being colonialist and said their Security Council will meet to straighten the security of the islands, given that the 30th anniversary of the Malvinas War is very close. So we want your comments on the strategic situation in Argentina and help the political circles here take this strategic perspective.
I'm very well aware of the Malvinas history. The Malvinas was stolen from the United States by the British at a time of weakness in the United States. The British never had a legal claim to the Malvinas. They just stole it. Now, it played a crucial part in the history of the administration of Ronald Reagan, because you had people in the Reagan administration, including the Secretary of State and others, who were nothing but British agents. And so the problem was that, and Reagan backed off on this thing, he was hesitation on his part at a certain point. That was a point that I was rather close to the inside of certain of these circles of the Reagan administration, not as a part of the administration, but as, shall we say, a friendly advisor on SDI and so forth. So the point is, the British have no decent legal claim to the Malvinas. But they do intend to crush every part of the world that has sovereignty. And the distinction is, you look at the finances of South America, look at Asia, Africa, for example. There is no sovereignty in Africa. None. There's only one worse tyranny than another. The British, and it's British. Now, you've got people in Europe, forces in Europe, which are also in charge of this Africa, but they're all agents of the British interest, the British colonial interest. So the thing we have to do, among one thing, which is to an unpleasant group of people, the British oligarchy. The British oligarchy has to be removed from power throughout the world. Let the people of the United Kingdom, or the Scotland and England, or Wales and Scotland and England, but especially Ireland and Scotland and so forth and England, let them each have their sovereignty, and we shall do just fine. And people will not be, we don't have to torture people for the pleasure of the Queen of England and similar kinds of people. And this is exactly that. We have some foul balls who are more British than they are Americans in high positions in the United States. I think we ought to swap. I think we ought to take some British fellows who are nice people and know how to behave themselves and invite them to the United States and give the British agents inside the United States the option of living in Britain, which we would more than strongly encourage them to do.
Well, on that note, I think I'll take a question from Ireland. This is from our friend Gene Douglas, who's watching from Armagh, Ireland currently, and he wants to ask you about the British Empire's green fascism. He says, Lína Chara, our developing organization in Ireland has adopted you as our founding father, since you have returned to us our famous bold imagination and given focus to our historic fighting spirit. You have reminded us that just because Ireland is a small island doesn't mean we have to be small-minded. So thank you for your ongoing encouragement as we lay plans to get Ireland back on its feet through the real Republican concepts of physical development and credit system economics. And thank you, too, for the frequent kick in the arse when you set us to scratching our heads, such as now, as we wrestle with the idea that we can overthrow the accepted notions of fixed space and time, and instead bend them to our free will. When you laid out a conceptual map outlining the new frontiers of the Arctic as the key to a world economic recovery, we eagerly accepted the challenge and began to consider how Ireland could play its part. We undertook a study of shipbuilding, with the intention of building real working ships, cargo ships, and icebreakers for the work ahead. In so doing, we intend to overwrite the oppressive sectarian legacy of the Belfast shipyard, whose first ship, the Venetian, was followed by warships for the British Navy and, of course, the ill-fated Titanic. Now we intend to unite our nation behind a new flagship, an icebreaker called the Gale. And I assure you, it will not be wind-powered, but nuclear. And we hope the concept of this mission, even before rivet is fastened, can inspire our island nation. Now, here's the question. Just because Ireland is known as the Emerald Isle doesn't mean we should be putting up with the most vicious form of British liberalism, the Greenies. So, let me ask you this question, Lyndon. Wouldn't the crushing of the Greenie movement, representing as it does the very worst of genocidal thinking, be a very effective and necessary step in restoring to the world the power of reason? Thank you, Gene.
Well, I would say in the same tone that he has sent the message, that there are several points to be made here. First of all, that the Venetian was named for a leading figure of the Venetian party, the Venetian, who became the king of England. And this was a very evil force, and who went into Ireland and did a general slaughter of the Irish. So the point is, I think we ought to recognize that William of Orange and his descendants should take a very modest posture in matters of world affairs. Keep their mouths shut most of the time, and don't scheme while they're keeping their mouths shut, because this thing cannot be tolerated. This is the oldest evil that we from the transatlantic community know, is this thing that led to the Roman Empire, which led to the other bars, which led into the Venetian system, which led into the collapse of civilization, and which launched the whole damn operation of the long religious warfare from 1492 to 1643. And that whole warfare was organized by this, what was called the New Venetian Party. And William of Orange was an official of the New Venetian Party, who had conducted earlier the wars against France. And this was all a process of rebuilding the Roman Empire around a new Venetian model. That new Venetian model is the British Empire, is the soul and other parts of the organ of the British monarchy today. And therefore one ought to understand, these pies have had too much time on this planet. Let them take a more modest position, a more humble position, when they can learn what it feels like to be under tyranny.
Okay, moving right along. And we have one more question that came in from Europe. And this is from a gentleman named Claudio Giudici, who's becoming very well known right now. He's the leader of a taxi union in Florence, Italy. And he's also an activist with the Movimento Solidarietà di Diritti Civili, the Movisol, our organization in Italy. And he's currently leading a national strike against the financial dictator Mario Monti and his policies of liberalization and austerity. Giudici, as people might know if you've been watching this website, has grabbed national headlines. He's been interviewed on several national television networks, and he's currently escalating his fight with prominent calls for Glass-Steagall and the policies of Mr. LaRouche. So here's his question. He says, "Dear Mr. LaRouche, one of the false myths pushed by economists is competition. Using linear approaches, which are easily understood by many, we can say that competition is not the only issue to be addressed, but only one among several issues, including, for instance, protection and promotion of quality, labor rights like minimum wage, protections introduced by civilized society for workers, efficiency, and others." He refers to a papal encyclical by Pope Pius XI. He says, "The social doctrine of the Church deals with the question of the failure of approaches that are centered around competition only. In paragraph 108 of Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI describes hyper-competition as a sort of virus that first leads to the creation of oligopolies, then to domination of economic powers on politics, and ultimately to conflict among states." Claudio says, "These descriptions are important because they help to understand the process as a sequence. However, I wonder whether the issue could be dealt with from a higher standpoint, not just a sequence, but a unity, an unicum," he says. And he uses an interesting analogy. Not so much like a Gothic church, but rather like the Florence Dome Cathedral. Thank you, Claudio Giudici.
Well, the point is to change the subject entirely. That the question is the progress of mankind, the ability of mankind to survive. Now, the beacon today for that is Mars. That mankind must be developed so that mankind has the power to reach Mars and to develop it, and to develop the larger parts of the solar system. Now, that's it. So it's that kind of purpose, not some kind of thing of some individual with his little scheme someplace. And they usually cheat a lot. And somebody who buys these things usually thinks so. So the point is, that's the point. It's the increase of the productive power of labor through the development of the intellectual powers of the mind, which is the vital interest. And it's that which must be the test of what is right and what is wrong. That which promotes an improvement in the productive powers of labor to do the human good. That's the good. That's the good. And whether something is more liked or disliked or so forth is irrelevant. It's garbage. And mostly, usually involves cheating. And you find a lot of the people in the Republican Party are very good at that. The Democrats don't like to admit it, but they're also a little bit sloppy at it, but they do it too. And we can do without that stuff.
Well, good. On that note, I actually have two questions that have come in from people who are watching the webcast here in the United States. The first is from Jim Stamps. He's a retired pilot, and he's a long-term supporter of the LaRouche movement. He says, "It seems to me that there's several comments which liken Mitt Romney to Obama. Do you see a Soros factor operating behind the scenes? i.e., with Obama nosediving, the empire shifts popular attention to his fascist nominal opposite?
Right on the mark. Exactly on the mark. Every fact is exactly on the mark. It's exactly that. That's the story on Mitt Romney. And we've run into it. We've got a study on his operations and how they were run. That's exactly what it is. You've got, well, anyway, that's enough said.
I think we're going to be putting out some background intelligence on this case, which we're pulling together right now. But on a similar question, now people are worried, obviously, because you have a bunch of clowns who are supposedly the opposition to Obama. So Natalia, who's also a LaRouche PAC supporter in the Midwest, she says, Mr. LaRouche, I would like to know, how can we find, finance, and positively get elected a new FDR? And is it too late in the election year to be able to do that?
It's never too late to win a war, because when you consider the alternative. And this is a war. It's a war against oligarchism. And we're trying to get the people to get the guts. Now, the people make a mistake on democracy. Democracy is often a badly used word, because people don't understand what it should mean as opposed to what they think it means. The essential thing is that mankind must progress. For man to progress, that means that mankind must develop. That development is partly physical powers, but it's primarily intellectual powers. So it's the development of the intellect of the human individual, which is the essence of this question of proper power. Now, therefore, some people will say the number of people who vote for something means law. It shouldn't. It shouldn't. Now, you don't do that by decree, but you do it by scaring the shame out of anybody who's on the wrong side on that question, as I did today. These people, these members of the Congress, some of whom I have a liking for, personally, but they're acting like asses. They're cowardly asses. And they, you say of them, let us bray. And that's what, the point is, you can ridicule whatever you have to do to get these people to stop being stupid. And the people do not have a right to be stupid. They shouldn't wish to be stupid. And therefore you're not oppressing them when you tell them not to be stupid. But what we have is people are being stupid. They're being corrupted. They like something. They want the sense of pleasure. They get a little more money than the next person. There's pleasure. They get something they think is fancier than somebody else is wearing. They think it's pleasure. And they don't think about that real pleasure is something that comes to you when you know you're about to die. It's the pleasure of knowing that you lived a good life and you've made a contribution to the future of humanity. And those thoughts, that's what must be taught in schools. That must be what's taught in politics. I've often seen in my own experience in management consulting and so forth, the greatest pleasure in this sort of thing is to take somebody who's confused, but they want to accomplish something, and to be able to assist them in accomplishing something which they can claim as their own. You may have inspired them to do it. You may have helped to teach them to do it. But it's their right. It's their accomplishment. It belongs to them. And you want people to grab for what really belongs to them and should belong to them, their own sense of their achievement in life. And they've got to have a sense that what they're doing also is going to be reflected in what the benefits that people down the line are going to benefit from. And therefore, the idea of doing good, sometimes the word of doing good, to do good, which was often used in the United States, to do good. That's the term. It's often made silly. But to do good is what Franklin did in actually creating the United States with his leadership from having left the Boston area and gone into Pennsylvania and been the spark internationally that made the United States possible, resting on what had happened in the previous century. And that's goodness. That's a good product. And the good product is a human being who makes the world after him or her better.
Right. I think he said at the end of his life to his son or his grandson, if you think that what I have done has been useful to the world, you can thank Cotton Mather. because when I read his Essays to Do Good when I was a young child, that's what shaped my entire life.
It's true.
Yeah. So I think that this is a sufficient overview of the questions that we've gotten. We have a lot more, but I think we've answered most of the important ones that we've gotten in terms of principle. Now, there are a lot of other questions which maybe you'll have a chance to answer in an email form, or we can take up at a later point. But in terms of the broadcast for tonight, I think that brings a conclusion to what we set out to do. So I thank everybody who watched this broadcast tonight, and please stay tuned to LaRouche PAC TV. We will be replaying this on our LPAC TV on air in the future. So thank you, and good night.